Good afternoon. Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources that we hope will help improve your life. I'm Stu Reed. Here's my co-host, Dave Bernstein. Hey, Dave.
Hello.
And today we have a very special guest. Dr. Nicol Turner Lee is a senior fellow in governance studies, the director of the Center for Technology Innovation, and serves as co-editor-in-chief of Tech Tank at the Brookings Institute. Dr. Turner Lee researches public policy designed to enable equitable access to technology across the U.S. and to harness its power to create change in communities across the world. She's an expert on the intersection of race, wealth, and technology within the context of civic engagement, criminal justice, and economic development. Dr. Turner Lee has a PhD and an MA from Northwestern University and graduated from Colgate University. Dr. Lee, welcome to Community and Technology.
Thank you so much for having me, Stu. I appreciate it. And hey, Dave, how are you?
Well, I'm going to pull some headlines, then we're going to go to you, and the end of the show, I'll come back to them. For example, it's not, this is airing tomorrow. Tuesday morning, Jeff Hinton, one of the key AI people, won the Nobel Prize for Physics. And he's earned it. He's done remarkable work. But they got what they said he did, they got it wrong. But I'm going to hold that for after Nicol. The other thing was, and Nicol's worked on this kind of stuff or related stuff, the judge gave his ruling on what Google should do since they lost the antitrust. That's really strong. And since I know you want to hear this, again at the end, I've looked at what are the best buys on Amazon Prime Day. The interesting thing is that both Best Buy and Walmart had exactly the same items at exactly the same price. And I'll pick out a few of the tech stuff that you find interesting. But let's get to Nicol.
Okay, Nicol, thank you for coming back on our show. It's been a while since we've spoken. I know one of the big things in your life, you just came out with a book, Digitally Invisible. Tell us about that, if you would.
Well, I am so happy to be back. And yes, I do have a book. I'm an author now. I mean, I've been writing a lot of stuff for many, many decades, but now I have this opportunity to sort of bring a gift back to our community around digital technology. So the book has really been a journey for me. I mean, first and foremost, I've been in this space for 30 years. And when I say 30 years, I mean, I've been working to bring the internet to communities, particularly marginalized communities and people of color. And why is that important? Because if you are listening, the train has left the station. Everything that we do right now in this world is online as opposed to inline. So Stu, what does that mean? I mean, this book has been about, I think, this experience of unpacking what digital access means to people. You remember the pandemic, right? When everything got appended and we all had to go online for services, ordering food, purchases, talking to friends and family. Well, that experience really was an experience that many people were dealing with prior to the pandemic. And I call those people, which is why the book is aptly titled Digitally Invisible. And I think the other point of the book that I hope that we can get into is that we need to do something different in our society when we are talking about bringing the internet to communities. There are too many seniors that still sit in digital deserts, even if they live in big cities like New York. They live in places and spaces where they're not getting adequate and sufficient internet access to do just basic things, like talking to their grandchildren. There's so many people, and I, as part of this book, I went around the country before the pandemic, whether it was a rural community where I visited farmers, believe it or not, a city girl visiting farmers. There were more cows than people. Let me just tell you, I almost hit a couple of those cows, unfortunately, based on the fact that I had no access to my GPS. And I also went to areas like big cities to talk to communities who were what I call, in digital deserts or just digitally blind to what was happening around us. And so, yeah, the book is really about, it's time to really rethink national policies. What is it going to take for the United States to get people connected? Because being connected is no longer a privilege or an option. It's just a necessity and way of life.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a connection for some of our listeners who may not be familiar with Ralph Ellison. His book, The Invisible Man, written some 70 years ago.
Yes.
I just want to read a quick quote because it's still apropos today. And Ralph Ellison said, I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you sometimes see in circus sideshows. It is as though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me.
Yes, you must have read that quote that I put in the book. I was like you, very inspired by Ralph Ellison since high school. And
Mm-hmm.
here was a man that, for all intents and purposes, did everything right, but yet he was still invisible to people. I call the book Digitally Invisible because I, as a woman of color, a Black woman in tech, I've been invisible, right? And
Mm-hmm.
starting the book really brought me to a frame where I sat on the outside of rooms where decisions were being made around just policy in general or technology over more specifically, and felt alone. And it was unfortunate, if you remember in the book, for people who remember that book, the poor man from Ralph Ellison book fell into a bunker and nobody even knew he was missing. And
Mm-hmm.
and and that was part of my inspiration for the tour that I did, because there's so many people across the country, like in Black a community called Marion, Alabama. I went all the way 2 to 3 hours outside of Birmingham, Stu, and
Mm-hmm.
met people that lived in this community where essentially not having access to the internet meant that there were kids sitting on the stoop in front of the high school just to be able to do their homework. And this was before the pandemic made more people do that. And teachers who found themselves in the parking lots of libraries just being able to do lesson plans when the pandemic hit. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
these are stories that don't get counted in the national news.
Mm-hmm.
These are folks that, again, like Ralph Ellison, we have this distorted view that everybody's connected. Just because you have a smartphone doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting the benefits of what technology provides.
Mm-hmm. So true. So true.
Well,
So,
let's
go ahead, Dave.
draw you out a little bit on that.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, everybody here has been involved with community networks and has worked on a lot of different things to get people connected. The biggest the biggest hurdle is the cost. And the most destructive thing done in the 20 years I've been covering broadband is when they ended the ACP. And I know you had a lot to say about it, so why don't I hand it over to you?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And Dave, do not age me, because I've known you for almost 30 years in the community technology center movement. I mean, I've been doing this work with regards to communities and technology. I want to say when President Clinton actually took office and he became the broadband president, and Vice President Gore at the time, they were the first to actually invest money in affordable housing. So even in spaces like New York and Chicago, we were actually seeing what were called neighborhood networks, where we were able to put some technology. Most of the time it was a utility room of a building, but we were able to bring, okay, I'm gonna date myself, guys, 386 computers. And you
I
remember,
wouldn't have guessed it looking at you.
no, I was working with 386 computers, and you all remember that screeching modem sound that usually ended with this mantra that said, "You've got mail." And that was America Online. I still am very suspect of people who are still on AOL, but I know there are a lot of people who still are, right?
Yeah. My wife is one. I know they're crazy. They're nuts.
But to your point, Dave, when we talk about the Affordable Connectivity Program, or you've called it the ACP, I do find that to be sort of a tragedy in our history when it comes to connectivity and communications in general. And let me just tell you why. I mean, we have phone service primarily because it was a national right. The universal service program was all about ensuring that people had access to 911. I did grow up at a time with a rotary telephone where I still remember my number was NE62437, right? Because getting access to the phone meant that you weren't going on the stoop and yelling out to your aunt or uncle, asking them if they had sugar. You could actually call them, right? And that was a big advancement across the country, particularly when we had efforts like rural electrification, where we were trying to bring technology and electricity to rural areas. But you fast forward to today, obviously the cost of broadband service at a monthly rate has gone down. I mean, some people do remember when I reference back to telephones that we used to pay long distance charges. And I'll give you a perfect example. I grew up in New Rochelle, New York, and
You
calling
grew
to
up in New
Mount Vernon.
Rochelle?
I did. I was
I'm
born in
sorry.
Queens, and
I'm
then
sitting in New Rochelle right now,
are
Nicole.
you? So my family, my mother was actually born in the west side of New Rochelle, right? And if you remember, calling Mount Vernon was like very expensive because
Yes.
you picked up all of the charges when you went on a rotary telephone. And
Mhm.
that had a lot to do with the fact that at the time, telephone companies were basically unregulated and they were very big. We had the breakup of the bells, and I think we had more affordable telephone service. And over time, we've seen not necessarily a breakup of the big telecom companies that everyone is familiar with, but we have seen the cost of the internet go down, but not to a point where most people who have to decide between broadband or bread, where they can make those decisions. And in this economy, it becomes even more difficult. So over the pandemic, we had the Affordable Connectivity Program. It was the biggest boost to what we call universal service since Ronald Reagan. Some of you out there may know about the Lifeline program. You may actually be on it. $9 is basically the cap to get mobile service through a phone. But here we had a service that was able to provide you with your choice of internet in your home. What started at, $60, I believe, went to $30, but now is $0 because the federal government couldn't come to agreement on continuing this affordability program. And now
For the federal government. We've got
well,
you. You're the
I
Washington
know.
insider.
Yeah, but I'm
I
not
may
I'm
know
not the
some things,
government.
but you're in the middle of this. You just spoke to the Congressional Black Caucus. What happened to the ACP?
We couldn't get bipartisan agreement. I think that's part of it. I mean, Congress has definitely shown us that they've not been able to pass a lot of bills over the course of this last session. And hopefully it will get better as we go into a national election. But we have to think about it. The Affordable Connectivity Program, just like any other communications program, requires bipartisan support. And I wrote a piece about this. There were 20 plus million households that were enrolled in the ACP, 20 plus million households, which meant that not only the student in the house was benefiting from having internet access, especially during the pandemic, to be able to stay connected to school, but there was probably a senior connecting to their doctor through telehealth, or probably an entrepreneur that was actually selling services by having low cost options available to them. I mean, the unfortunate thing is when I wrote the book, I had the ACP in the book, and then over time I had to reduce it a little bit until I eventually had to change the narrative because we couldn't get bipartisan support in Congress to figure out ways to fund it. We ran out of money. And we should have expected that because many people are still economically vulnerable, which is the purpose of what I try to do in my own research. And I hope people will go to your local bookstore or to a retailer online to purchase the book. This is full of stories, right? The book is about people like us who have to navigate between having food on the table, having connectivity, but are soon learning that having connectivity actually provides for food because it allows you to work. It allows you to stay healthy. It allows you to learn. It allows you to connect with providers and people. It keeps you out of loneliness. There's so much that we could say about some of the consequential outcomes of being connected for our children. There's a big debate on that right now. But we do know during the pandemic, if we didn't have it, we wouldn't have thrived. I mean, how many Zoom funerals did many of us attend during the pandemic, particularly those of us who were Black, who had people with comorbidities that were most likely to die during that time? So, Dave, to your point, I mean, we hope that we'll have the conscience of the incoming administration to rethink this. Believe it or not, on the Republican side, Mr. Vance actually stood up the ACP in terms of continued funding. I can't believe it, but it's on record that he stood there as a senator to say that we should continue the funding. And Vice President Harris, as well as her vice running mate, Tim Walz, also did the same. So perhaps there'll be some political will to address the affordability issue, but it's unclear because we have so many other issues that have been top of mind during this election that we'll have to wait and see.
Mm-hmm. Wow. You know,
Okay.
Nicole, you mentioned something that kind of struck me, and you talked about all of the ripple effects of having connectivity, the learning, the job, the healthcare, and so much. And one of the issues that I've run across so often is that folks don't know that.
That's right.
Low-income folks don't know the benefits of broadband and what you can do and how it can benefit them. So many folks, why do I need this? You know, well, why should I spend my hard-earned money? I got to make a decision between eating or car fare or medical expenses and broadband. And so many of us don't even know that if you're able to kind of somehow figure out how to do it, that will enhance other areas of your life. So to me, that's one of the big things that hurdles that we have to overcome in our community is helping people learn and know about the, why,
That's
the
right.
actual applicability
Now,
to their lives.
Well, in the book,
let's reverse the radio show. We have 3 people here who've all worked on community networks. Me a little, the other 2 a whole lot. Stu has done more for community networks than anybody I know in the United States. And I've probably written more about it, but I haven't, and volunteered on one of Stu's projects, but haven't done nearly as much as he does. So let's reverse the radio show. Nicole, why don't you ask Stu what will make a program work? How you reach the people. And of course, the reason I care so much is this $2.5 billion that's about to be wasted mostly because they're not doing right by the community. But you guys are the expert. You ask Stu the questions.
Well, Dave, I like to do that, but Stu's better as a radio host than I am. I've never been a radio host before, so I'll do better than that. I wanna respond to what Stu said on these stories, and then maybe talk a little bit about so people understand this $2 billion plus. It's actually more than that, right? Don't you think at this point that is out there for communities to benefit, and then Stu, I mean, Dave is trying to tell me to quit my day job. I'm just a researcher and sociologist, I don't know if I'm a really good radio host. Maybe I am. Maybe that's my calling. But, I want to just go back real quickly, though, to the stories of relevancy, right? And I think that will inform Dave's question as well. One of the things that I tried to do in the book is to write it for my 81-year-old aunt to actually keep it open and to also for policymakers, right? Because at the end of the day, getting access to the internet is not a usual civil rights struggle. And I want us to kind of point that out to people who are listening. We think about voting rights as a usual civil rights struggle. We think about economic wealth creation as a usual civil rights struggle. But what we don't think about is there are now pathways that are digitized to get to those ends. And we are, as a community, not always benefiting from them because we don't realize the relevancy of being connected. And that's why I think the pandemic was a big proof of concept, although it underplayed the fact that there were millions of people not connected prior to the pandemic, millions of kids that were not connected to the pandemic in many respects in their own communities. And so I think the stories are really relevant. People that I met like Joseph in Staunton, Virginia, an African-American guy whose 4th generation family lived in this rural community, whose cell phone, because of the data caps, cut off. And as a result, he was not able to get work. He was a day laborer. And so there was no option for him to supply the necessary means for his family. Or Frances, who was crying at the front desk of a library to renew her library card because she just found out she had stage 4 breast cancer and she needed to go into the library to communicate with her doctor. I mean, there's a certain digital civility that we have to give people. And that's why this is a civil rights concern. People have to engage in transactions that are no longer in line, online. And that makes this a social determinant of how we exist in society. And more than that, we live in communities that are historically segregated and impoverished due to a series of structural consequences of racism and other historical, elements. And we have to also think about people are not connected oftentimes in certain communities because they're not living in communities where there are resources that establish sustainable housing. And so when we talk about things like digital discrimination, it overlays itself on housing segregation. And I think to Dave's point, I mean, what we've seen in the Biden-Harris administration is this influx of money. Some of it was going to the Affordable Connectivity Program, which is now being wind down, but a lot of it was going towards infrastructure, bringing infrastructure dollars to communities to be able to develop the facilities. And a portion of it, for people who are interested, your states and your cities are also getting money for digital equity programming to bring certain programs to the grassroots level so that churches and community organizations and other organizations can work together to develop not just infrastructure, but the programming that increases the value for people being connected. I mean, I would suggest, and here's where I'll try my radio hat, Stu, in your experience as an activist and organizer and networker, it's been difficult for Washington to understand our experiences. That's why I thought storytelling was a big strong suit of this book, because they don't know about us.
Yeah.
As Kendrick Lamar says, they're not like us, right? And they don't know about us, which makes it more difficult for them to encapsulate our conversations. Putting on my radio host hat without taking your day job, right? What was so different about those days before when we actually got stuff done, in Harlem and other communities, the Bronx? We just talking about how my first internship was at HUDC, Harlem Urban Development Corporation, making communities like Harlem vibrant. But what was different about that?
Well, for me, the big element is community engagement, and not just engaging, but really the community being involved in the inception and the planning and the implementation of programming. That's where I have seen success in our work here in the South Bronx and Harlem and Brooklyn too, in bridging the digital divide, is actually involving the community residents, people themselves, in designing what applications and services, in getting them to actually not just to say what they want, but actually to run it, to implement it, to put it in. So it becomes their system, it becomes their services and their technology. To me, that's the big difference. And we saw some of that back in the 70s, back in the old days, where the so-called the anti-poverty programs, where you had folks on the ground that were actually doing stuff. They were deciding what needed to be done. The dollars came in, and the folks on the ground did the implementation. I haven't seen that in broadband at all. At all. Our group applied for the BTOP under both iterations of BTOP, under both administrations, and we were totally ignored. We had a partnership with the Public Housing Authority. We just got money from New York State, but they decided they were going to give the money to the incumbents and not fund any new starts or any innovative providers or suppliers. And when you do that, you totally miss the boat. When it's top down, it doesn't work. When it's what can us big guys do to help you folks out? That kind of paternalistic attitude and approach just is a non-starter.
And we'll come back after a brief musical break. And beside finishing this part of the discussion, Nicol has been writing about what is the tech policy of our presidential candidates. And she's been starting to do a whole lot of work on AI. But we're going to lose her in about 10 minutes. So let's get the break on.
Okay, this is Community and Technology on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. We're right back after a brief musical break. Okay, we're back. Community and Technology, Dave and Stu Reed's special guest, Dr. Nicol Turner Lee. Before the break, Nicole, we're talking a little bit about, what kind of programmatic approach works and what doesn't work. I know you had some further thoughts, so go ahead.
So, I really appreciate the conversation we're having around community involvement. And I think that's something, again, if you look beyond my 30 years of doing this, I think you're completely right. I mean, I do write about, unfortunately, I was familiar with the top program, the B top program, and B top two. So for people, you don't necessarily need to know the acronyms, but there was a lot of political will that came out of many of the Democratic administrations when it came to treating this like a social program. And I love your reference to the anti-poverty movement, because one of the things I think we need to do better in politics when it comes to internet access is to think about this as a bigger part of our economic competitiveness. So let me tell you a little story, if you don't mind. I was in China for a conference a few years ago, and I kind of write about this in the book. And I found myself sort of coming off of the major area of the conference and just walking around this small water town. And obviously, if you've ever been to China, they don't see a lot of Black people in general. So there was a lot of stares. In fact, I think I heard one woman whisper, "Is that Michelle Obama?" Of which I am not her. I am much shorter than her, and I am not her, even though it was a huge compliment, trust me. But I found myself underneath this bridge at this local marketplace meeting this 88-year-old woman who spoke no English and I know Chinese. And essentially, when I got ready to pay with my cash that I had picked up and held for this type of visit, she pulled out her smartphone and a QR code. Mm. And she asked me if I wanted to scan the QR code, with the show of her phone. And I write about this towards the end of the book as a thought that got provoked, which is why I don't call the book Digital Divide, because I think we get constrained by it as a social program. At the end of the day, this woman had a QR code because China has made a commitment in this rural town to connectivity as the same way we used to make the commitment to the rotary telephone being available in everyone's home. And for her, that was the way she was able to engage in commerce. And here in the United States, we don't just have that type of technology readily available to all. Just recently, I think we've really delved into the QR economy, where we're now seeing it much more conspicuously, compared to prior years. My point with that is we have to make this conversation around competitiveness. Shame on us in the United States that we have a shortage of workers in technology spaces, because every company, Stu, is a technology company, right? We're not talking about companies that are analog anymore, but yet we don't have a commitment to have no child left offline in America's school system. We don't make tablets or laptops a priority alongside textbooks, which no one carries anymore. And think about it. During the pandemic, we gave lots of money for schools to become wired. But after the pandemic, we're rolling back those programs. That's my first point. Shame on us that we've not made digital technology an incentive, whereas every worker realizes now that the way to apply for a job, to be screened for a job, to exercise employment doesn't necessarily require a 4-year engineering degree. You just have to have a basic level of competence on how the internet works, because those functions are becoming more digital. But yet we don't have workforce programs that are focused on that. And the programs on digital literacy are seen, like the ACP, as ping pongs, as part of political reference and partisanship, which we shouldn't be doing, because we have a shortage of workers in cybersecurity, in the evolving artificial intelligence space, data scientists, computer scientists, clerks, general clerks who are working and making sure the train is moving. I was just on a conversation about robotics and manufacturing. Let me be the first to tell you that even if a company goes towards robotics, they still need human people to run the machine. And so, I think we have to move the conversation from this being a social program to something that at all levels of government and community, we recognize just how important the technology is to our DNA and our modernization as a country and a world.
What do you think's holding that realization back? I mean, maybe we realize and don't have the political will. What's the resistance then, Nicole, from from where you sit?
Well, I think some of the resistance has come because the government has seen this as a social program on the output of people and communities like us, that it's not focused on the evolving and rapidly advancing innovation sector. I mean, can we be real about it? You know, OpenAI, I think, hits the news probably every other day. One, I've never seen a person get fired from their job 2 or 3 times and then become a big billionaire based on an IPO. I mean, if that's the formula, somebody tell me how you do
Right.
it, because if I get fired from my
Yeah,
job,
fire
I
me.
got to start all over. Right. Exactly. Right. But, you know, those companies, which are now part of, I think, the evolving ecosystem of artificial intelligence, for example, where we're seeing them create products and services where we're all agents and subjects of that technology, it sort of perpetuates what I think a new divide, which is going to be people who cannot benefit from artificial intelligence or become victimized or discriminated against
Mm-hmm.
because those predictive models say something about our worthiness when it comes to credit or suitability when it comes to employment. So I think where we missed the mark is we've treated this as not an issue of how does our country sort of coalesce and keep up with the evolving industrialization, this new technological revolution in ways where it makes sense. Listen, I'll end here because you just made me think about something. When we were in high school, we had to learn the typewriter, didn't we, Stu? I
Sure
mean, you
did.
probably, I mean, I'm just going to tell people I am not as old as Stu. He looks great.
Now,
I
you
think
look
I
like a
look great
kid
and feel
compared to
great.
me, Nicole. Let me just say, thank you. Thank
But
you.
that technology was necessary, right? We
Yeah,
had
come
to
on.
learn that
Absolutely.
technology to
Yeah,
work in our society.
yeah.
Before we
Today,
leave our
it's not
guests,
important. Yeah.
before we lose our guests, I understand you're coming to New York soon. Give us the
I am.
details.
Listen, I love New York, and any chance that I get to talk about this issue with friends and new friends and communities, I'm there. So this is National Digital Inclusion Week. I think there are groups across the city that and across the country that are celebrating this. I've had the opportunity to talk to many public libraries and community organizations. Next week, I hope to be in New York to talk before a council of educators who are trying to solve this problem. And I hope to come back and come to Harlem, Stu, and actually sit in the places that raised me. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I do remember when there was a Woolworth across from the Harlem Urban Development Corporation, and they sold liver and onions too. I remember that. And I used to go there for lunch. It made
Yeah,
for a very long lunch break,
yeah,
but I
yeah.
went there for lunch, right?
I hear.
My point is, like, we got to give back to our community. So, Dave, people can follow me on LinkedIn, Nicol Turner Lee without an E, and get more details on the book tour and when I'm coming to New York. But more importantly, pick up the book. I want to hear from people and just know what you think. And I want to know if those stories resonate with you, because as we've been talking about, this is an all hands on deck strategy. It's our new political civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm. And the book title is Digital Invisibility. And who's the publisher, Nicole?
The publisher for this is Brookings Press, which is an imprint of Bloomsbury Press. And so it's widely available. In fact, I'm going to reprint. I'm so excited about it
Wow,
because
nice.
you need to
Yeah.
have another conversation about independent Black authors and what they experience.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's been a journey, to say the
I
least.
know, I know, I know. My wife is an author, so we've been there, so I know that. Yeah.
Yes, it's been a lot of work. And Dave, to your question earlier about what are the politicians going to do about this issue with this election coming up? I don't know until we see. I mean, we know technology is invading most parts of this election. It's not a secret that election disinformation and misinformation is, you know, infiltrating parts of the campaign. I just actually wrote a piece on it's coming in the forms of memes now, where we're actually disguising some of this rhetoric through satire. But, you know, I think in the end, I do think that both camps will in some way try to leverage the technology, but I do think there'll be on one side of the aisle, maybe among the Democrats more so than the Republicans, that we will see an administration that cares about keeping people connected and doing what they do best, which is to put the money towards a social program. But I'm hoping that somebody will hear this conversation today, whether in the White House or in the streets of New York, and really think about ways in which we make this an issue that's related to every vertical in which we're putting people in: education, workforce, health and human services, transportation. Technology hits every one of those verticals. And I would hope that people, before they leapfrog into procuring at the government level, particularly local governments, artificial intelligence tools, that they think about digital equity first to make sure that the people that they're buying the tools for can actually benefit from them.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. One last topic before you go, Nicole. You mentioned AI.
Yes.
And the fact that there's a lot of lack of equity in that as well. I know during the break we were talking a little bit about AI ripping off Black music.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that. What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, artificial intelligence, just for folks who hear that but don't quite understand it, and Dave is quite skilled on this through his crash course and his 30 plus years in technology. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that this is just the next evolution of technology as we know it. But the difference is that it has the ability to predict. So when we talk about predictive artificial intelligence, we're basically talking about, for example, in the most extreme case, policing systems used by law enforcement that are able to detect where they think there will be a higher probability of criminal activity, which at the same time sort of feeds into the over surveillance of certain communities and the over policing of those communities. And then there's what's called curative AI or generative AI, which is based on information that is already available on the internet that gets scraped and actually fed into these models to train them. And so I'm working on a project right now around generative AI and Black music. As well as I do, Stu, that Black musicians have had some time being able to get the appropriate royalty and attribution to their work, dating back to the Motown days and even before.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen in the last year or so the 50th anniversary of hip hop music, which originated in the Bronx, where many of those artists really saw that as a freedom of expression, but they didn't have the technology that we have today to do the remixing and composition and the creation and productivity tools. My paper is basically suggesting that there should be no technology that erases the cultural artifacts of communities or appropriates them differently. And what do I mean by that? In generative AI, as I mentioned, most of that information is available. Your image, your voice, your text, your archives, your photo that you put up on the internet is actually training generative AI models that rely upon that to sort of regurgitate back great synopsis and in some cases similarity or replicas of what you've actually put out there. And we have to be careful when you start to go in spaces where your likeness, your voice. I mean, I was looking at generative AI the other day and I put in my book and it gave me a really good synopsis suggesting that it read it, but it didn't pay me for it. And when people do not get attributed, right, it becomes an easy way for people to consume content without giving attribution back to the creative industry. And we've seen that happen when it comes to the implications as well on jobs. There were a lot of writers and screenwriters who were particularly upset that they were going to be displaced in terms of their creative process when it came to writing scripts, because AI would actually, do it as well as they could, at least we thought, simply because
it's not that good.
It's
today.
not, I know, and it doesn't have the empathy, right, Dave, and the feelings and
the empathy's coming.
Yeah.
Times had an article from a doctor who said the ChatGPT did a better job on empathy with his patients than he did.
Yeah, but it all depends on whose empathy.
The empathy's coming.
Yeah.
It depends, though, on whose empathy, right? So one of the things, just to sort of add on to this, that you guys both know, I've developed what's called an AI equity lab, which is to push more representation. If we're going to have these products, then we need people sitting at the table building these products that have the representation of those communities. So the empathy may be coming, but is the empathy coming because there were more nurses? Yes, more nurses,
and
more
there
patients.
are no people at the top of AI, at the top of the companies, and I know dozens of the companies and hundreds of the people. None of them look like you or Stu.
That's right. That's right. In fact, there's a guy in New York. I'm gonna make sure he hears this because I'm gonna give him a huge shout. John Passmore. He's been working on a black involved large language model, so sort of his Chat GPT, by training it on Black history artifacts. But it's a company that is taking an indigenous view of creating these models, and he's right out of New York as well. John Passmore, his product is like this Black Chat GPT, the Latimer Project, excuse me, its formal name. And he's really thinking about ways in which you put indigenous trails and artifacts into these models in ways that make sense to communities. Because I'm gonna tell you, it is the work. I just for demonstrative purposes. So I have a 17-year-old who knows how to do all this stuff. I'm not going to profess that I play around with these myself often. And so she says, "Mommy, I use this large language model tool, generative AI, and I'm going to show you a summary of your book." And so she plays it, and the tool says, it's all about Black Americans. That's what the tool says. This book about Black Americans, they said Black Americans so much, I lost count. Well, if you read the book, it's actually about Black Americans, but it's also about white Americans. It's about farmers. It's about Latinas. It's about communities, urban, rural. So I was actually curious as to why they actually lean that way. But if my instincts are right as a sociologist, because I'm a Black author, it potentially inferred, based on the things that I write about, that I probably was focusing on Black Americans. ChatGPT, which is the OpenAI product, actually had a better synopsis, which I thought was absolutely amazing. I was like, I need these talking points, right? But the thing I got worried because I was like, it's so good that they obviously read the book, and somehow there's no attribution for this book beyond their synopsis. So, I mean, to our conversation with artificial intelligence, particularly people listening, there are going to be ways in which it's going to be transformational. But at the same token, because of the lack of representation and the lack of understanding of people being at the table to represent their joy and their trauma and the design of these products, there are going to be ways in which the product will use us all and our data as subject matter content and not necessarily give us attribution or compensate us for its use. And that's why the journalists are upset. That's why the authors are upset. That's why the music creators are upset. And anybody who actually is in the artists themselves in the business of creating something have created some resistance. And actually, I would say, Stu and Dave, even the workers are upset, because they also see this as a threat to their livelihood. Look at what happened with the dock workers. I never in my life saw a sign like that.
One piece of good news, though. A lot of people in AI thought it would be a disaster for employment. And we're talking about like the head of the European Bank, thought that jobs would disappear massively.
Right.
A lot of the AI people, some of them were saying, we have to have a universal basic income because there's not going to be enough jobs for people. Well, fortunately, I can tell you, I know some cases where they're replacing people in jobs, but there aren't that many of them. And it's happening much slower than the AI people and all the pundits and everybody in the Times thought it would happen, which means you have time to learn and to take advantage of it.
You do. And I think we have time to understand which jobs is also going to affect. So you're right. I also think, Dave, on that note, I also think that there are a lot of people who weren't having it too. So those dock workers holding up a sign, I reject automation, was quite interesting, because remember back in the days, it used to say, I am a man or I am a worker. Now it's saying, I reject the machine. So
we'll have you back sometime soon, Nicole, when we can finish
Dr.
this
Turner
conversation.
Lee has to go. We've been talking with Dr. Nicol Turner Lee, who is an incredible expert on digital equity, on the intersection of race, wealth, and technology within the U.S. and across the world, and has just come out with a fascinating book that I recommend everybody go grab, Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. And it's available online. I know Amazon has it. Your bookstores have it. Highly recommend it. Any parting thoughts, Nicole, before you leave us?
No, this is wonderful. But you know what? I need to come back because we got to still debate that AI issue, Dave. So let me know when
There's
we're going to go on
lots of
round two.
complicated things. It took me, I'm now 18 months into spending 60 hours a week learning this,
Yes,
and there's still a lot I don't
Yeah.
know,
that's right.
including all the linear algebra and vector calculus.
Yeah, all the classes that I did not like to take, which is
Yeah,
why I'm in
right.
sociology. Thank you both, though. I really appreciate coming back to family and talking about this book. And I appreciate all your listeners because this is where the talk really happens. So
Thank
thank you
you.
so much for having
Thank
me.
you, Nicole. It's been a real pleasure. And please do send us a link when you're going to be in New York so we can spread the word on that.
I will. Thank you. Thank you both.
Okay.
In fact, we have 1,500 people in the New York Internet Society, where Stu is an officer, and we may be able to get a mailing out. I don't know. It may be too late, but let's see what we can do.
Perfect. I'll let you know. But I am coming back to New York to do a whole separate thing from next week, just because it takes a little time to coordinate everything. So,
thank you.
But thank you. Appreciate you both.
Okay, Dr. Nicol Turner Lee. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, this has been Community Technology. Dave, we're out of time. So thanks all for listening. This has been Community Technology on WHCR.
I have to come in for
90.3 FM. Dave has one quick point before we sign off. Dave.
Because I said at the beginning of the show that Jeff Hinman just got the Nobel Prize for his work on neural networks. Absolutely earned and deserved. He's done extraordinary work. But the Nobel people said that he invented this stuff, and it was what he did that was the base of what all the things we're seeing now is. Well, I've read a lot of stuff from Jeff Hinton. As I say, he's done incredible work, but he would be the first to tell you he didn't invent it. He was not the first. He had an enormous amount to do with making it practical and working as well as it does today. But the Nobel Prize committee got that wrong, but they got it right to give him the prize. See you next week.
Okay. Again, Community Technology every Wednesday, 5 p.m. on WHCR 90.3 FM and on the web at WHCR.org. Tune in. Just might learn something. Thanks. Good night.